Taxes. Governments levy taxes to raise revenue for public projects such as schools, roads, and national defense. And because the taxes are such as an important policy instrument and affect our lives in many ways, we will study the tax several times. In this section, we begin our study of how taxes affect the economy. And we have a simple question to be answered to analyze the tax effects. When the government levies a tax on a good, who actually bears the burden of the tax? The sellers or the buyers, or both? And what determines how the burden is divided? Can the government legislate the division of the burden, or is the division determined by more fundamental market forces? Taxes discourage market activity. When a good is taxed, the quantity sold is smaller. Buyers and sellers share the tax burden. These some lessons about tax incidence can be learned by applying the tools of supply and demand. Tax incidence is the manner in which the burden of a tax is shared among participants in a market. In other words, tax incidence refers to how the burden of a tax is distributed among the various people who make up the economy. And we can follow the 3 steps for analyzing supply and demand. First one, we have to decide whether the law affects the supply curve or the demand curve. The second one, we decide which way the curve shifts. And the third one, examine how the shift affects the equilibrium price and the quantity. We begin by considering a tax levied on buyers. And suppose that the government passes a law requiring buyers of ice cream cones to send $50 to the government for each ice cream cone they buy. What are the effects of this law? We have to apply our 3 steps. The first one, we see that the initial impact of the tax is on the demand for ice cream. The supply curve is not affected because for any given price of ice cream, sellers have the same incentive to provide ice cream to the market. By contrast, buyers now have to pay a tax to the government whenever they buy ice cream. Thus, the tax shifts the demand curve for ice cream. The second step, we next determine the direction of the shift. Because the tax on buyers makes buying ice cream less attractive, Buyers demand a smaller quantity of ice cream at every price. As a result, the demand curve shifts to the left, as we see. In other words, to induce buyers to demand any given quantity, the market price must now be $0.50 lower to make up for the effect of the tax. Thus, the tax shifts the demand curve downward from D1 to D2 by the exact size of the tax, $0.50. The third step, how the demand curve shifts. We can now see the effect of the tax by comparing the initial equilibrium and the new equilibrium. You can see in the figure that equilibrium price of ice cream falls from $3 to 2.8, and the equilibrium quantity falls from 100 to 90 cones. The tax on ice cream reduces the size of the ice cream market. And buyers and sellers share the burden of the tax. Sellers get a lower price for their product. Buyers pay a lower market price to sellers than they did. But the effective price rises from 3 to 3.3. Figure 7, when the government levied a tax on sellers. We have to apply our 3 steps to see the effect of the tax on sellers. The first step, to decide whether the law affect the supply or the curve demand. We see that the immediate impact of the tax is on the sellers of ice cream. And because the tax is not levied on buyers, the quantity of ice cream demanded at any given price is the same. Thus, the demand curve does not change. By contrast, the tax on sellers makes the ice cream business less profitable at any given price, so it shifts the supply curve. The second step, to decide which way the curve shifts, and because the tax on sellers raises the cost of producing and selling ice cream, it reduces the quantity supplied at every price. The supply curve shifts to the left. The third step, to determine how the supply curve shifts, we can now compare the initial and the new equilibrium. The figure shows that the equilibrium price of ice cream rises from 3 to 3.3 and the equilibrium quantity falls from 100 to 90 coins because sellers sell less and buyers buy less. In the new equilibrium, the tax reduces the size of the ice cream market. We can now return to the question of tax incidence. Who pays the tax? Although sellers send the entire tax to the government, buyers and sellers share the burden because the market price rises from 3 to 3.3 when the tax is introduced. Buyers pay 0.3 more for each ice cream cone than they did without the tax. Thus, the tax makes buyers worse off. Sellers get a higher price, 3.3, from buyers, but the effective price after paying the tax falls from 3 before the tax to 2.2 with the tax. Thus, the tax also makes sellers worse off. To sum up, the analysis yields two lessons. Tax discourage market activity, and both sellers and buyers share the burden of the tax.